Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for weathering this first serious storm. So thank you so much for coming. Welcome to the 2012-2013 Lectures in Catholic Experience. My name is Christina Vanine. I'm a member of the Department of Religious Studies and director of the Master of Catholic Thought program here at St. Jerome's University, and I'm coordinating this year's lecture series. Before we start with the evening, would you please turn off any devices that might make any kind of sound that we don't want to hear on our recording? Please. Thank you. The theme of this year's Lectures in Catholic Experience is Vatican II, Envisioning the Next 50 Years. At Vatican II, we were invited to read the signs of the times of the 1960s, to be in solidarity with the whole of humanity, especially those who are poor or afflicted. And so in this year's lectures, we are considering the signs of our own times. And we are also going to hear about individuals who are witnesses to the meanings and values of a life of faith. And that is why this evening we're so pleased to have Dr. Greg Donaghy with us to deliver this year's John J. Wintermeyer Lecture in Religion and Politics. And I'm going to ask Dr. John English to come forward to introduce our speaker. Dr. English served as a Liberal Member of Parliament for Kitchener from 1993 to 1997. He's been a professor of history at the University of Waterloo since 1971, and he is currently still a distinguished professor emeritus of this university. He's authored many celebrated books, including award-winning biographies of Lester B. Pearson, and most recently, the 2-volume biography of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Dr. English is currently the general editor of the Dictionary of Canadian Biography. He is a member of the Order of Canada, a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, among so many other things, but I'm highlighting a few here. And he is a lifetime member of the Canadian Institute of International Affairs. Dr. English.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight and to introduce Greg Donaghy for the Wintermeyer Lecture. I knew John Wintermeyer, and it is appropriate that these lectures be named after him. John Wintermeyer was a very principled and able politician, and a very courageous one. In the mid-1960s, when Paul Martin was very active in Canadian politics, John Wintermeyer was the leader of the Ontario Liberal Party, and he took a stand in the middle of the 1960s in favor of health insurance, Medicare. He was in a riding that had many insurance agents and companies, and he was defeated in his own riding. He chose principle and belief over political expediency. And when I met Paul Martin for the first time in 1969, I said I was from Kitchener, and the first question he said to me was, "Do you know John Wintermeyer? He's a fine man." And he was. And Paul Martin is very much an appropriate subject for Greg Donaghy. Greg Donaghy was a former student of mine, a colleague, advisor, and is a close friend. He studied at St. Michael's, as did Paul Martin. He went on to Carleton, and then he moved up in the world and came to Waterloo. And he received his doctorate at the University of Waterloo. He's a most interesting person, and he was a most fascinating student. He is a contrarian. The old song goes, if you say tomato, I say tomato. Say potato, I say tomato. That's Greg. If you say right, he says left. Like Professor Toohey, if you say right, he says right. And in both senses of the term. Greg came to me as a student from Carleton University. And I asked him when he came, what did you write your PhD thesis or MA thesis on? And he said, I wrote it on the New Democrats, or a middle road between communism and capitalism. And he said, I'm a New Democratic supporter too. And I said, well, I'm not. And we started off on that note. So I read his thesis. It was a wonderful MA thesis. And it actually helped me in understanding Pierre Trudeau, who had similar kinds of views like Greg did. He shares a lot with Trudeau, but I won't go into what it is. But Greg Donaghy is I will go into one thing. Greg is a very serious person about his faith, as was Pierre Trudeau. But you wouldn't know it by knowing Greg. You wouldn't know it by knowing Trudeau. But in both cases, they are very serious people about what we are talking about tonight. He did his PhD thesis on the relationship between Canada and the United States in the 1960s. It was an excellent thesis, immediately recognized as a thesis that should be published. It was a prize-winning book. It's a book that is still cited. Professor Toohey told me tonight that it was plagiarized by one of his students just this week. And what higher tribute can you get than plagiarism? But equally unpredictable, it's been praised by every right-wing conservative in the country. And it completely disagrees with my point of view in the period, but nevertheless, it is based on solid research and something that is very characteristic of Greg, insightful comment and analysis. He's the ideal biographer of Paul Martin. He went to St. Michael's. He is a practicing Roman Catholic. He's very serious about his faith. And as I suggested in the comments before, he's serious about political life. And the relationship between the two is important to him. It's important to Paul Martin. Was important to Paul Martin. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to Greg Donaghy, the historian at the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade. But he's not speaking for John Baird tonight. Thank you very much.
Well, let me begin by thanking John for those kind and witty remarks. My remarks sadly won't be nearly as witty. I'd like also to thank Christina and Ryan for inviting me down here. I'm sorry about bringing the weather from Ottawa. I owe a special vote of thanks for Ryan as well for arranging for Santa Claus and 4 of his elves with electric guitars and 3 busloads of students to serenade me last night with Christmas carols. So thank you, Ryan. I do have to offer a bit of a disclaimer quite officially. I am with the Department of Foreign Affairs and I'm head of their historical section, but I assure you that I'm not speaking on behalf of the Government of Canada or the Department of Foreign Affairs this evening. The way I've structured tonight's remarks, I'm going to start with Paul Martin, more or less as he is in the history books, as he left politics in the late 1960s. I'm going to work his way back to the Paul Martin, remind us a little bit about the Paul Martin who was there in the 1940s and 1950s, who stood for a particular kind of politics. And then we're going to go back to the beginning and look at where Paul Martin kind of comes from. It is absolutely, as John said, very appropriate that we're talking about Paul Martin at the Wintermeyer talk, because the two men were not only colleagues, but they were good friends. And when John Wintermeyer ran for the leadership of the Ontario Liberal Party in 1958, Paul Martin showed up with loads of Catholic voters from southwestern Ontario, the Ottawa Valley, and northern Ontario, so much so that the man that John Wintermeyer defeated complained rather bitterly in a letter to C.D. Howe that Paul Martin wanted to turn the Liberal Party into the Catholic Party of Canada. So let me begin. Poor Paul. He was so easy to caricature. The hapless Windsor MP contested and lost the Liberal Party leadership, I'll remind you, not once, not twice, but 3 times. His ambition and appetite for politics and self-promotion were legendary. He shocked Canadian diplomats by demanding press releases with Canada, the Liberal Party, and Paul Martin in the first line. But not, he added, in that order. He once jumped from a helicopter into a war zone patrolled by Canadian peacekeepers with the greeting, "Anybody here from Windsor?" External Affairs has hardly recovered. He spoke like a politician. Martin's tone was stentorian, wrote political reporter Peter Newman. His sentences endless and his sentiments vague. Even his hometown paper, the Windsor Star, once labeled him the most confusing man of the year. He looked the part of the politician. He wore bespoke suits from Savile Row, sported a flashy diamond ring and oversized cufflinks, and fretted about unspeakable things like hair color and TV makeup. His rallies were slick and professional and vaguely American. There was a whiff of scandal about him, too. Martin's Windsor stronghold enjoyed a reputation for easy virtue. It housed rum runners and speakeasies in the 1930s, and you could still shoot craps in downtown alleyways in the late 1950s. The unsavory aura clung to Martin. Liberal insiders and ministers, clutching their scotch amid the cozy woodwork of the establishment Rideau Club, grinned when one of them, McGill Law professor Max Cohen, quipped, "I worry about Paul's soul." That final judge, history, not God, did too. Its votaries, after poking about the archival offerings, nodded sadly and dismissed poor Martin as a lightweight, a simple parish pump politician. This is grossly unfair. Paul Martin was certainly ambitious, and he could bob and weave with the best politicians of his age. But he was always more, much more, than just an old Paul on the make. When he moved to Windsor in 1930, he was 27 and stony broke. He had borrowed a classmate's rail pass to get there. In his bags, he carried fresh degrees from the U of T and Osgoode Law School and graduate qualifications from Harvard and Cambridge. His instincts, though sometimes cautious and pragmatic, were progressive, reformist, and forward-looking. His career would unfold as a consistent and undervalued battle for social justice at home and abroad. Martin's adult political career began in the early 1930s as the Great Depression seized Canada. Within a few short years, industrial production was down 42% and unemployment was up to an astounding 27%. Neither conservative Prime Minister R.B. Bennett nor the Liberal opposition leader Mackenzie King understood the extent of the crisis or the need for reform. Paul Martin did. He nailed his colors firmly to the Liberal Party's progressive reform wing. He defied the warnings of his petty and jealous leader Mackenzie King and backed Mitch Hepburn's reformist takeover of Ontario. He also joined the party's national secretary, Vincent Massey, whom King regarded as a noxious rival, in a search for a new liberalism of active interventionist government. These were courageous steps for a politician to take, a young politician, and they drew King's ire. Martin campaigned hard for social and economic reform in the mid-1930s as he fought for the Liberal nomination in Windsor and then for victory in 1935. Capitalism would stay. To say that we must overthrow all that we have built does not sound rational, he argued, but there would have to be great changes. He placed individual welfare at the core of his program. We've been living in a system whose sole point is profit, he argued in 1934, a system which is not only bad for economics, but bad for morality. An early disciple of radical British economist John Maynard Keynes, Martin favored more state intervention long before it was fashionable for liberals to do so. He demanded unemployment insurance, old age pensions, mother's allowance. He insisted on labor's right to bargain collectively and laws that made it possible for workers to insist on those rights. Industry must realize that it has some responsibility for the welfare of its workers, he declared. That's not socialism, it's social justice. Life was tough as a backbench MP in Mackenzie King's Liberal government. If ever there was a man that was remote, it was Mackenzie King, Martin remarked. You know, if Mackenzie King said hello to you, God, you got home and you put that in the book. The pragmatic and ambitious Martin was constrained by party discipline in the 1930s. Nonetheless, he challenged his prime minister's cautious inactivity. He championed the new League of Nations and a more activist foreign policy. He backed a national scholarship program for university students, and he sponsored legislative action for unemployment insurance. He won a sterling reputation as a leading voice of progressive reform, but little else. When the Second World War came in 1939, Martin remained stuck on the government's backbenches. It was, he wrote his young wife Nell, almost like being sent to Coventry. That changed with the fall of France in May 1940, the gradual transformation of the war into a people's war, and the rise after 1942 of the left-wing Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. As King's government responded to these changes by embracing an agenda for post-war reform, the Prime Minister found Martin a role, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Labour. Public advocacy was Martin's genius, and after 1943, he emerged as one of the leading spokesmen for the government's wartime and post-war agenda. He backed labor to the hilt. He tackled industrialists and employers, reminding them that workers are not trash. The war was being fought to democratize the workplace, he insisted. Labor must be free to organize and bargain. He championed government regulation and planning, as well as Keynesian measures to promote full employment and economic security. He got plenty of flack from Toronto Tories and the Catholic hierarchy in Quebec, but he won over labor by his heartfelt convictions. The workers trust him, wrote Montreal Labour in 1945. They know he will leave nothing undone. The Prime Minister had come to trust Martin too. As the war came to an end, King overcame his scruples about having an extra Ontario Catholic in his cabinet, and he promoted Martin to Secretary of State. The new minister remained firmly on the party's left wing. Though labor issues fell beyond his mandate, Martin helped resolve a major Ford strike in Windsor in late 1945. King, who fancied himself a reformer, sighed with satisfaction. I find Martin a help around the cabinet table in defending labor's position, the Prime Minister confessed to his diary. This was the kind of change that Martin welcomed as an integral step towards a new Canada. There was soon more. In 1946, the Windsor MP unveiled Canada's first real Citizenship Act. It was time we knew what a Canadian is, he explained. The job left him time to join Canada's delegations to the new United Nations, and he emerged as an advocate for an active post-war foreign policy. He won few victories against the cautious inclinations of the professional diplomats and their wary Prime Minister, but he reveled in the UN's promise of international cooperation. He was excited by its willingness to bite into everything and to speak out against injustice, no matter whom it might embarrass. Canadian diplomat John Holmes cheered him for this gesture of faith and confidence in the world as it exists. He was almost alone in doing so. Martin's domestic accomplishments were more important. King promoted him in late 1947 from Secretary of State to Minister of National Health and Welfare, where he stayed until King's successor, Louis Saint Laurent, was defeated 10 years later. Cabinet shifted rightward during that era, leaving Martin, as one reporter remarked, the sole Liberal in a high Tory cabinet. That meant trouble. The most influential minister, C.D. Howe, treated Martin with open disdain. Well, he liked to say, here comes Paul, the savior of mankind. Martin gritted himself for battle. He recruited a team of reform-minded doctors and progressive administrators and drove them very hard indeed. His deputy minister, George Davidson, described him as the most difficult and demanding minister I ever worked for, and at the same time, the most worthwhile, the most rewarding. He recruited the U of T's great welfare advocate, Harry Cassidy, and revamped the wartime plans for social welfare that had stalled over constitutional difficulties and federal-provincial bickering. He abandoned comprehensive measures as unattainable and plotted a piecemeal strategy for change. In the spring of 1948, Martin pushed through cabinet a program of federal health grants that injected millions of dollars annually through the 1940s and 1950s into public health and hospital construction. In doing so, he was creating the vital infrastructure needed for public health care. He returned to the charge in the 1950s. He won the battle to replace the existing and much-hated means-tested pension with a universal benefit that added a whopping $300 million to the federal budget. But expanding health care was a tougher fight. He almost won Saint Laurent's support for a national health insurance program in 1952, but the Prime Minister backtracked. Martin himself was trotted out to explain the retreat, a bitter humiliation that rankled when he wrote his memoirs 30 years later. Other blows followed in 53 and 55, leaving Martin badly marginalized in cabinet by the late 1950s. And then, suddenly, the balance of power shifted. When Conservative Premier Leslie Frost of Ontario embraced hospital insurance to boost his sagging fortunes, Martin was quick to exploit the opening. He forced Saint Laurent's hand, and by early 1957, the final pieces of a hospital insurance plan were finally falling into place. Citizenship, universal pensions, health care, the very foundations of a modern Canada. Not bad for a parish pump politician. But I think we need to ask, where did this push for social and political reform spring from? What ideas, what ambitions guided his path? In a secular century, the surprising answer lies in his faith, his religion, his Catholicism. At first glance, this might seem unlikely. Martin grew up in an era when the Catholic Church, particularly the French-Canadian Church, represented a conservative bulwark against liberalism. But his ambition and drive, his reformist, perhaps even radical agenda of worker rights and novel notions of citizenship and global order, of an activist state supplying pensions and health care, clearly marked Martin out as an unusual sort of Catholic politician. His politics and his ambitions were deeply rooted in its Catholicity. Born in 1903 to French-Canadian parents, Martin was the second oldest in a family of 7 children. He was born in Ottawa, but grew up in Pembroke, a remote and rough-hewn lumber town on the edge of the Ottawa River. He inherited a devout French-Canadian Catholicism. His family stood, as he later put it, very close to the church in devotion, belief, and association. The family fasted regularly, attended Mass daily during Lent, and ended each day with the Rosary. It lived in one of a small number of houses clustered close to Pembroke's Cathedral and rented from the local bishop. The family's devotions were hardly unusual, but their significance was reinforced in the Martin household by more immediate evidence of divine intervention. At the age of 4, Paul contracted polio, an illness that was sometimes fatal and often left even its surviving victims badly crippled. The prognosis was poor. Goose oil and prayer were recommended the local doctor. That's all that can help that boy. Martin's mother, Lumina, trusted in prayer. She bundled her son onto the train and set off for the popular shrines of Sainte Anne de Beaupré and the new chapel of St. Joseph's on the slopes of Mount Royal, where Brother Andre gathered the faithful. Recovery was slow, but eventually Martin walked again, though he remained burdened with a weakened left shoulder, an impaired left arm, and a bad left eye. It was Brother Andre, Lumina always insisted, who made other cripples walk, who made it possible for Paul. Polio set Martin apart. He had few close friends of his own age in town, and because of his illness, he spent a great deal of time with Lumina, absorbing her fears, her ambitions, and her faith. His mother hailed from a family of small-town lawyers, priests, and shopkeepers, whose feet were planted precariously on the lowest rungs of the middle class. She inherited their upward aspirations. Lumina fretted constantly about the family's finances and impressed upon all her children the vital importance of getting ahead in this world as well as the next. She was, her son recalled, a very aggressive woman, the activist in the family. She was very ambitious for her children. Like his mother, Martin worried about the family's finances and considered himself poor, a haunting insecurity that he never escaped. As a teenager, he strongly resented the differences in wealth and influence that divided Pembroke's affluent mill owners from its poorer citizens. He could recall being touched deeply when his own father lost his job in 1921. He was a strong man physically, and I can see yet the agony, the frustration, the sorrow, the disappointment, the bitterness. This sensibility fueled a progressive social and economic outlook that grew stronger as Martin matured. He was a worrywart, too. His good humor was frequently offset by a solemn seriousness and a sense of purpose. Lumina often spoke about the nobility of public life, and even as a small child, her son wanted to be a politician. Mostly, however, Lumina spoke of the priesthood, and she was deeply gratified when Martin showed evidence of a priestly vocation, daily rising at the crack of dawn to serve morning Mass at the local convent of Mary Immaculate. When Bishop Paddy Ryan, famed throughout the Ottawa Valley for his prowess in identifying vocations, offered to pay Martin's high school fees to follow his calling, a time-honored route upward for ambitious and devout Catholics, Lumina and Paul seized the chance. Paul was 15 when he left home in 1918 to study at the Collège Apostolique de Saint-Alexandre-les-Gatineaux in the small Quebec town of Ironsides. Martin did well at St. Alexandre over the next 3 years, though he was never at home there. Nicknamed the Holy Ghost up the Gatineau, after the Spiritan fathers who ran it, St. Alexandre was a bilingual junior seminary training priests for English and French-speaking parishes on both sides of the Ottawa Valley. Run by a tough and athletic Alsatian priest, college life was meant to be shaped by a driving thirst for a disciplined liberty. There was lots of discipline, but very little liberty. The clock tower bell tolled the passing of each monotonous day. Prayer, study, meals, play. Students, confined to the isolated campus along the banks of the Gatineau River, rose at 6 a.m. for Mass, breakfast on porridge and toast, and ate dinners of pea soup, meat, and pudding. The curriculum was narrow, traditional Catholic theology, as well as Latin and Greek composition and literature. This was not the life Martin wanted, and when he encountered a former teacher decades later, he was unusually bitter, telling his wife that we all thought he was a son of a bitch. The school's impact on Martin's politics was much more fundamental. By 1918, his attachment to the Liberal Party and its leader, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, was already in place, inherited from his father. St. Alexandre, however, would sharpen Martin's identity as a French Canadian. Like many communities in the Ottawa Valley, Pembroke was deeply divided along linguistic lines between its French and English inhabitants. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 and the imposition of conscription in 1917 over French-Canadian opposition sparked a crisis in national unity. The national crisis echoed through Pembroke and in the Martin household. I can remember feuds around our family table, Paul recalled, meal after meal, month after month. This division was doubtless uncomfortable for young Paul, and St. Alexandre represented an avenue of adolescent escape and self-definition. There, like most of his French-Canadian classmates, he embraced the wave of nationalist enthusiasm that swept through Quebec's classical colleges in the post-war. The students he met were very Quebec. They were very French, very nationalistic. I was a nationalist in those days, he later boasted, and prejudiced against English-speaking people. So his Pembroke childhood gave Martin three things: a restless ambition linked to his mother and his miraculous recovery from polio, a vague awareness of economic inequality and social justice, and a devout but pretty traditional Catholicism, which was inevitably bound up in his narrow identity as a French Canadian. St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto, where he headed in September 1921, would forge from these key characteristics the core of the mature Martin. St. Mike's was a different world. When Martin arrived there, rolling up from Union Station on the Yonge Street tram, the college was a bustling hive of physical and intellectual activity. The city of Toronto was just beginning to widen Bay Street, tearing down the college buildings on the eastern edge of campus and transforming St. Mike's from a countryside idyll into a construction site. Students and faculty dubbed the campus the Sand Heap. The college's intellectual pedigree was more impressive. Founded in 1852 by the Basilian Fathers as a joint Catholic high school for boys and a seminary, St. Mike's had joined the University of Toronto in 1911 as a semi-autonomous federated college. It remained profoundly Catholic in outlook and inspiration. It was staffed almost exclusively by priests and religious and continued to enroll significant numbers of students headed for religious life even in the 1920s. Many students, including Martin, regularly attended daily Mass, and a 3-day silent retreat during Holy Week was compulsory. Women students, admitted only in 1912, were segregated and generally took their classes by themselves. It was, an early woman student recalled bitterly, a man's world. The masculine Catholic environment eased Martin's transition from the rural bilingual St. Alexandre to the urbane and English-speaking St. Mike's. It was all very foreign to me, Martin admitted. It was all very strange, but very exciting. I was happy almost from the first day I put my foot on the grounds of St. Michael's. Martin delighted in the college's more liberal discipline, enjoying the freedom to go out at night and to choose his own courses, and at the prospect of expanding his horizons. In this respect, the outward-looking dynamic college he encountered in 1921 fitted him to a T. Under the guidance of Father Henry Carr, a young and liberal-minded Basilian, St. Mike's was actively shedding its Catholic isolationism to embrace the university and the world around it. Carr, who became superior and college president in 1915, encouraged his students to pursue sports, especially football and hockey, and other intra-university activities as a means of breaking out of the Catholic ghetto. St. Mike's welcomed Carr's ambitions for a Catholic elite prepared to lay siege to the exclusive social and economic bastions of Protestant Toronto. Federation, too, was changing St. Mike's. Under pressure from the university, the college was moving away from the Catholic theology that had dominated its curriculum since the mid-19th century. Carr delighted in the change, pressing his younger staff to pursue the growing interest among Catholic theologians in the medieval thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. The new scholasticism drew a sharp distinction between theology and philosophy and was ready to engage the Western philosophic tradition more directly in a dialogue on contemporary and modern issues. Carr also built up the college's staff. In 1919, he lured the Thomas philosopher Maurice de Wolf from Louvain, a leading center of liberal Catholic thought. Prominent Catholic thinkers, Sir Bertram Windle, the outgoing president of the National University of Ireland, Fathers Leon Noel and Gerald Phelan from Louvain, and Etienne Gilson followed, giving St. Mike's in the 1920s one of Canada's most vibrant philosophy departments. The intellectual temperature here, recorded one faculty member, rises 10 degrees when these men are around. It seems unlikely that Martin was fully aware of these currents when he encountered Father Edmund McCorkle on his second day on campus. The Basilian priest, who became a mentor and lifelong friend, had a more significant role to play, steering Martin towards the study of philosophy. By the early 1920s, philosophy was seen at St. Mike's as an essential for the education of a cultured Catholic gentleman. It was also good preparation for the rigors of law school, where the college sent an increasing number of men and where Martin was already planning to go. Martin's undergraduate courses were a fundamental part of his education and shaped his politics, his faith, and his identity. In contrast to the otherworldly Catholic orthodoxy encountered at St. Alexandre, the philosophy program at St. Mike's was broad-ranging, comprehensive, and modern. It began with the Greeks, Plato, and Aristotle, and moved forward through the early church fathers, St. Thomas Aquinas, and mainstream Western thinkers, Descartes, Mills, and Kant. McCorkle's lectures on 19th century thought introduced Martin to the liberalism of John Stuart Mills and gave an intellectual foundation to the Laurier liberalism that he grew up with. The Thomism instilled by St. Mike's was equally bracing and just as lasting. Martin was drawn as well to John Henry Newman, the slippery and often elusive English divine, whom the Anglican historian Owen Chadwick shrewdly labeled a conservative innovator. The cardinal's reverence for authority and tradition suited Martin's heritage and his cautious personality. One generation, Martin often insisted, had no right and no capacity to pass judgments on the traditions of mankind. But he was mostly inspired by Newman's demands for an order, a social order, a political order, where Christianity, always changing to remain the same, retained its vital force as a governing factor. Engaged in the world about him, Martin's Newman was a careful reformer whose probing critical reason forged new tools to tackle new problems, ever guided by Christian revelation. In an increasingly secular age, when many progressives were shedding their religious faith, St. Mike's gave Martin grounds to hold tight to his. Martin's faith and politics were shaped outside the lecture halls too. He threw himself into varsity life. Unlike most of his classmates, he arrived on campus knowing precisely what he wanted to be. Certainly a politician, probably a cabinet minister, and possibly even prime minister. He chose his extracurricular activities accordingly. He dabbled in sports and drama, but focused on student politics and debates. His success there reinforced his standing at St. Mike's, where he was admired for his maturity, his judgment, and his intellectual balance. His friends called him Sweet Paul, a teasing reference to his fondness for desserts, but also a reflection of his friendly disposition. His vast amiability, classmate and future novelist Morley Callahan wrote, made him popular. St. Mike's nurtured Martin's political ambitions, which marked him out among cynical undergraduates as an unusual student. They claimed to see through his quasi-political techniques, and they sometimes mocked him as a serious, plotting classmate. Behind his back, aware of the delight he took in seeing his successes noted in the campus press, they tagged him the Great One. Persuading his contemporaries of his sincerity would be a lasting challenge for Martin. But his professors and teachers, more worldly, more experienced, were less inclined to question the motives of an ambitious undergraduate. His humility, and especially his capacity for admiration, impressed them. They took him up, opening doors whenever they could. His connections with McCorkle and Carr led to Bergen Bickersteth, the warden of Harthouse. A charter member of the British establishment, Bickersteth was en route home to England when industrialist Vincent Massey offered him the warden's post in 1921. Funded by the Massey family, Harthouse was intended to introduce Toronto undergraduates to the best Oakbridge traditions and to serve as the university's cultural center. Bickersteth was an inspired choice. Just 33 years old, the warden was interested in youth who responded warmly to his open-handed manner. When he overheard Martin dismiss him as a damned Englishman, he invited the Canadian around for tea. The effect was magical. Harthouse overwhelmed Martin. It was, he recalled, an unforgettable institution. The library, the lovely dining room, the music room, the paintings, all those things young Canadians never saw at home. Like McCorkle and Carr, Bickersteth took Martin's political aspirations seriously. The warden derived a unique joy, he wrote his parents, in watching young freshmen, green, underdeveloped, narrow and restricted, beginning to play their part on the Dominion stage. The Anglican scion lectured the French-Canadian Catholic on the virtues of tolerance, and the two became fast friends. Massey, Bickersteth, and their friends embodied the post-war nationalism of an independent Canada, and they taught young Martin where his faith and heritage fit. A tolerant, perhaps even ecumenical outlook would help remove barriers between classes, races, and religions. This generous perspective would soon lead Martin to embrace Alfred Zimmern's interwar internationalism with its strong ecumenical overtones. Harthouse did something for Martin, Bickersteth wrote Prime Minister Mackenzie King in 1929. Whereas he came here as an undergraduate with sharply developed racial and religious prejudices, he has now got rid of those. In due course, Bickersteth made sure that Martin met all of his liberal friends, including the Prime Minister, Mackenzie King. 4 years at St. Mike's gave form and substance to the liberal ideas that Martin had held on his arrival. During the summer of 1925, soon after his graduation, the Pembroke Kiwanis Club invited the town's most recent graduate to give a youthful perspective on the pressing issues of the day. As his sponsor had hoped, his French-Canadian nationalism, by no means entirely extinguished, had been smoothed over, replaced by a new attachment to tolerance as the central political and social virtue of Canadian democracy and the keystone of national unity. The University of Toronto, he told his audience, had many religions, but functioned as one harmonious body, teaching us that the solution to our difficulties lies in tolerance. Such views placed Martin on the left wing of his Liberal Party. His other central ideas on leaving St. Mike's were equally progressive. He insisted on full and independent nationhood for Canada, though he was careful to retain a link to the fading British Empire. He flirted with proportional representation and bemoaned the suffocating grasp of party discipline, which stripped individual voters of independent thought and decision and replaced them with party spirit. That kind of compulsion, he warned, leads to communism and the socialist nightmare then sweeping across Soviet Russia. While young progressives across Canada were embracing fashionable collective doctrines, Martin grounded his economic ideas in his faith. I believe that the only way to remedy conditions of poverty, he told Pembroke's leading citizens, is the adoption of the spirit of Christianity and the acknowledgement of God. He reminded the town's factories and mill owners of their moral duty to create the conditions of life that would make people happy. The virtues of tolerance, liberty, and economic justice animated Martin's talk. They were values that his studies and experiences at St. Mike's and the U of T had nurtured and reinforced, and they were inevitably rooted in its Catholicism and its transformation. Martin inherited his faith. the narrow and traditional Catholicism of an isolated outpost on the middle reaches of a northern river. Its limitations were reflected in the disciplined liberty, the parochialism, the exclusive nationalism that he encountered in his seminary at St. Alexandre. St. Mike's and the people he met there transformed that faith. Martin embraced Carr's liberating ethos of engagement with the world beyond the Catholic ghetto. He relished exposure to the broad Western philosophical traditions which gave his liberalism roots and a reformist thrust. He thrived amid the ecumenical network nurtured by Carr, McCorkle, and Bickersteth. He crafted a politics that was open, generous, and tolerant. Throughout the long career that was about to unfold, Martin's faith remained linked to his politics. In the best Catholic tradition, he always treated his political career as a vocation. "I am not afraid to be called a politician," he often declared. "Next to preaching the Word of God, there is nothing nobler than to serve one's fellow countrymen in government." His mother, Lumina, who remained a potent influence in his life, also detected the steady hand of God behind her son's success. When St. Mike's awarded Martin an honorary doctorate in 1952, she wrote him feverishly, "I shivered a wee bit with pride. Who knows, but with humility also, because God had willed it that you should have done so well." Long after his mother's death, Martin's parents, his faith, and his career remained inseparable. "O Lord," he prayed nightly, "be good to my father and mother. May their souls rest in peace. May they give me inspiration to do great things for Canada and the peace of the world." Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Donaghy has agreed to take some questions. So if you would like to ask any questions or make some comments, then you can make your way to one of the two side microphones, and I'll just ask you to be as concise and to the point as you can. And I'll let you handle the questions yourself. Okay.
Just a quick question. He had an aura as a politician, being almost like a politico. How did that reconcile with his faith?
You mean when we say he had an aura as a politician?
As an operator?
You mean he had a reputation as an operator?
Yes.
And I'm not sure how he would necessarily reconcile it with his faith, but let me start by reconciling it with his personality, because he loved politics. And while he took politics very seriously, he also enjoyed politics. So, and you see that actually at St. Mike's. He was, when that picture where he was president of the Student Administrative Council, the Student Administrative Council that year actually didn't get very much. It got one very important thing done. For a liberal politician of that generation, it introduced the student administrative fee to fund its activities. The rest of the time, the council was always in a state of upheaval as they played this kind of ongoing game of shifting around in parties and defeating the government, and that's important because I think and he loved that. And if you get into his archives and his papers, you will see that he really enjoyed that, and it fit in with his personality. But he also understood politics as a kind of a social process, and he just played. He accepted the rules of the game, and so there wasn't. He didn't come along and have a large agenda to resolve the political process per se. He understood that, the way the system was set up in Canada, you worked within a party, one party or another, and that's how you got things done. And he was always quite prepared to accept that kind of a system. He wasn't out to overthrow the system. So I don't want to present him as somebody as a revolutionary, but within that system, he was prepared to play the game by the rules to achieve the kind of substantive reforms that he wanted to achieve. So I think there are kind of two elements there.
You said, Greg, that he accepted the rules of the game, and I accept that. But did he feel the rules of the game were biased against him? And many of the comments you talked about Howe's remark about Martin, the Savior. But in terms of the cabinet itself, in terms of Canadian politics at the time, in terms of liberal politics, you also commented on he was the second Catholic minister from Ontario. But one gets a sense from Mr. Martin's memoirs, and even more from his conversation, that he did feel the rules of the game were biased against an Ontario Roman Catholic politician. His views of Walter Harris, his views of Mackenzie King. And it's true, there was a Roman Catholic Prime Minister. There had been one before, a Liberal Prime Minister. But one gets the sense that he felt the game was against him. And the comment that Howe's friend made about the Catholics trying to take control suggests the same kind of thing.
Oh, yes, I think there's no doubt that, I think the philosophy at St. Mike's, the kind of sense that was as a community that had been besieged, the anti-Catholicism at U of T in the turn of the century and into the 1920s was strong and palatable. So amongst the elite at St. Mike's, the Carr and McCorkle and the other people that Martin would have encountered, there really was a sense at the time that they were under siege and a marginalized force in Canadian politics. And Martin definitely inherited that sense of being under siege, on the margin. And there are lots of, he compares himself quite a lot at various points in interviews that confidential interviews that he gave in the 1970s, where he talks about Mike Pearson won the leadership. Mike Pearson beat Martin for the Liberal leadership in 1958 because he was part of that Protestant establishment, and that Martin was not, and it was not fair. And he can go on at some length about that. And when he ran for the leadership in 1958, it was pretty clear. It was pretty clear to anybody who could count, and Mr. Martin could count. It was pretty clear that he was not going to win, and it was clear a long time before that he was not going to win. And I argue, in my look at the reasons behind his decision, that one of the reasons he decided to run really had to do with the sense of feeling as a marginalized person, that he wasn't going to be pushed around because he was Catholic. He wasn't going to be marginalized because he was Catholic. I think he had other reasons for running as well, but I think that is one of the reasons that he ran. So.
Thanks for the lecture. My question is about Paul Martin's ideas. So you had said at one point that he wanted to persuade the owners of the factories to treat their workers fairly as part of social justice. Did he also think of ideas such as workers owning the means of production?
No. That would be a bridge too far for Martin. He was in many senses a classical liberal coming out of the kind of the 19th century mold, and he really did feel that the less government, the better. But by the same token, he didn't hesitate to kind of look at, if you looked at a particular set of problems in society and feel that government intervention was where the solution lay. He doesn't hesitate at all to make those kind of arguments in the 1930s and 1940s. The talk, one of the problems with doing this kind of a talk for someone like Martin, I think, is that you have to remember he's only 21, 22 years old when he's talking to the leading citizens of Pembroke. He's a very young guy. He doesn't know where he's going to end up. And so he's not writing down detailed notes on his ideas and kind of hammering out a philosophy of where he's going. And that makes this kind of thing, kind of difficult to put together and kind of nail down detail. But he's not anti-capitalist. He's not, which is, what many people on the left are. He's very much a classical liberal. Part of that, of course, he feels that, he wants, part of that is tied into kind of the freedom of the individual, and part of it is tied into the kind of economic freedom as well. So,
I would like to thank you for your lecture about a period of Canada that I don't know very much about. I came to Canada in 1957, which was, of course, Suez and Mike Pearson's peacekeeping, and he was very much in the limelight. And sort of being young and starting a family, I never really was concerned. When I first knew Paul Martin was when he was High Commissioner to the UK. But my question is, in his political life, and I think what we have seen in the the last few years, is public castigation of the politicians by the church. For example, as you mentioned, going against the conservative hierarchy of Quebec. Did Martin encounter any of that, or was it, because I was not too active in politics in the early 60s, but I just wondered whether that was a factor in being a Catholic politician at that time.
He's concerned, he runs into trouble with the church twice in a way that he felt was significant enough to kind of record in his memoirs. One is in the 1930s, he gets deeply involved in the League of Nations and in the local organization, the Canadian Institute for International Affairs and the League of Nations Society in Canada. He sets up branch offices in Windsor. And both of those kind of envision a different approach to international affairs, and kind of a universal approach to international affairs, and a more ecumenical approach to international affairs. They're part of there's a series of kind of dialogues that are all going on in the 1930s and into the 1940s that kind of involve the politics and the religion of internationalism and everything else. And there's a certain amount of suspicion about that amongst Catholic clergies, and he gets into a certain amount of trouble with the Catholic clergy in the Windsor area for his activities there. In the 1950s, he gets into a certain, with the health grants. The federal government moves into the health field in a big way in the late 1940s and into the 1950s, and the whole question of health insurance is coming up. And as the federal government pushes into the health area, there are all kinds of questions raised by bishops who are running Catholic church or Catholic hospitals and various kinds of medical facilities, and they're worried about their autonomy and issues like that. And so I don't want to say that he's in trouble with them, but he often encounters a certain amount of resistance. And again, if you look at the files, the archival papers, you'll see he's continually reassuring bishops and priests and reverend mothers, etc., that he really is not interested in having the state take over their facilities. He's interested in supplying money and guidance to bring their facilities up to kind of a Western standard.
Thank you.
Greg, could you say something about, you talked to us about what his own family life was like, the influences on him. Can you say anything about the kind of family life that he created, and what might be, if any, contrasts between what he might have grown up with and what he might have created as a parent in his own family.
Wow. Yes, there is a, there is a huge contrast, and you know, I mean, he's not a saint. I mean, he loved his family, he loved his kids a lot, as far as I can tell. But he and his wife Nell, who again, as far as I can tell, had a long and lasting and loving relationship. I mean, it seems to be you know, a very, very close relationship, but it was a very unusual relationship for the time. She was a very independent and outspoken woman, and she had surprisingly little to do with his political career. After the kind of first blush of the honeymoon kind of wore off, and things like that, so she was not very active on his political career. She ran the household. She took care of the entire household. Was run by Nell. She brought up the two children, Paul Jr. and his sister, Mary Ann. She would leave Ottawa as soon as she could at the end of the end of the winter in the spring, and she moved down to a cottage in Colchester just outside Windsor, and that's where she stayed. And there were long periods of time when Paul went one way and she went the other way. If you Paul Jr. Was a little bit older than Mary Ann. He was born in '38, so Paul Sr. was still a backbencher, and he never felt his father's absence at all. In part, I think, because as Paul Sr. moved up the kind of political chain, and the demands on his time grew and increased in the late 1940s and 1950s, Paul Jr. was a little bit older, but he was also able to travel with his father in a way that Mary Ann was a little too young to do at the time. And so her recollection very much is that there was no family life. That's what Mary Ann says, whereas Paul Martin Jr. feels that they did have a strong family life. But I think the bonds in the family were very, very strong, but there were huge periods of absences. And as I say, the relationship between Paul Sr. and Nell was a pretty unique one for the 1940s and 1950s.
A lot of thoughtfulness out there, so there'll be an informal conversation after the talk. But right now I'd like to invite Dr. Ryan Toohey. He's a faculty member in the St. John's University Department of History and director of the Chanchalali India Policy Center, to formally thank our speaker.
Thank you, Christina. Greg, you've provided all of us with a rich and insightful talk this evening on how Catholicism and a Catholic education profoundly shaped the political and social views of a young Paul Martin Sr. You've added nuance and texture to a prominent individual who served Canada at home and abroad for decades. And yet he's an individual that few of us know beyond the ram of his legacy as a politician in his later career. So on behalf of the St. Jerome's community, thank you very much for being with us this evening and for a wonderful presentation on Paul Martin's Catholic journey. Thank you.
A couple of things before we finish up. First of all, I want to sincerely thank the family and friends of the Honorable John J. Wintermeyer, who created this special fund in his memory, and therefore make it possible for us to think about the relationship between religion and politics each year. I want to remind you that if you haven't done so, you can sign up in the foyer if you want to receive the latest information about our series and receive reminder emails and so on about upcoming speakers. Every year, this university is pleased to present this provocative program of speakers to you. We're able to provide these lectures to our community at no charge thanks to the generosity of partners and supporters. So if you would like to support our lectures, there are donation envelopes on some of the chairs and also in the foyer. And we thank you so much to all who have given so generously to us. I also want to let you know that we are videotaping our lectures and they will be available on our sju.ca website. And we're moving that process and they should be up there fairly quickly. So if you need, whenever you want to go back or you want to let other people know who weren't able to be here, we will make those available. In the foyer, if you haven't noticed on your way in, there are a number of wonderful fairly traded products available for sale by our Social Justice Committee. And also that Wordsworth Books is in the foyer. Some of Dr. Donaghy's books are there and some other wonderful books on the table. And finally, our next lecture in the series is 2 weeks from today on Friday, December the 14th. On that evening, Dr. Massimo Fagioli from the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, will be coming to help us look at the core issues in the way that we interpret the meaning of Vatican II. Dr. Fagioli is a professor of the history of modern Christianity, and he's a member of the University of Notre Dame's research network on Vatican II, and he has a couple of recent books on Vatican II, one about its meaning, and the other about the implications of the liturgical reform that happened at that council. So I hope that you will join us in a couple of weeks for that provocative talk. So finally, thank you so much for coming this evening. I hope you have a safe trip home, and until next time, good night.